Chapter 1, here we go. The problem of sectarianism in the Middle East in the age of Western hegemony. Today, more urgently than ever, we need to recuperate a history of coexistence in the Middle East. When was this book written? Title page. I think it was 2007. 2017. This is a fairly recent book. Yeah. Okay. Every carefully choreographed act of ISIS cruelty that we hear so much about presents more than an obscene vision of alleged piety. It also lashes out against a rich history of pluralism that ISIS and its fellow travelers appear intent upon obscuring, effacing, and denying. I'm just downloading the dictionary because I want to see what the definition of pluralism is. Okay, that's downloaded. From the outset, let me say two things. First, I do not accept romantic notions of age-old existence. Second, less do I accept or believe in historical notions of a deep or medieval Oriental religiosity that allegedly haunts the Middle East. Such notions are the essence of vapid scholarship and journalism. The geopolitical context of today is not the same as that before the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, or that of 100 years ago, let alone a millennial ago. That's true. The great Sigmund Freud wrote in Civilization and Its Discontents about what he called the, quote, narcissism of minor differences, end quote, that in any society could turn into something far more dangerous, namely, this sentence doesn't make sense. The great Sigmund Freud, hi Kitty, hello. Hello. You gonna read with me? Yeah? Good boy. Sigmund Freud wrote in The Civilization and Its Discontents about what he called the narcissism of minor differences that in any society could turn into something far more dangerous, namely group hatred. Freud's point was that every society carries within it the possibility of turning on its constituent parts. Civilized society, he wrote, is perpetually threatened with disintegration. The modern Arab world is no exception. Yet mainstream Western journalism about the Arab world routinely informs us that Sunnis and Shias are today replaying the original schism from 1300 years ago. Take the BBC correspondent Jeremy Bowen, who informs us solemnly that the weight of a millennium and half of sectarian rivalries is crushing hopes of a better future. Bowen describes Saddam Hussein as the Sunni strongman who fought Shia in Iraq. What does this phrase, the Sunni strongman, actually mean? Saddam Hussein, after all, was also Tikriti, Baathi, Iraqi, and Arab. He collaborated at different points with the USA, the Soviet Union, the Shah of Iran, the Shahs, plural, of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saddam Hussein also killed Sunni Kurds and Arabs and communists and anyone else who threatened his rule. He invaded Sunni Kuwait, all inconvenient facts that complicate Bowen's absurdly one-dimensional and highly misleading sectarian narrative. Think indeed of how Western journalisms, such as Bowen's and many books in English about the Middle East, routinely identify individuals from the religion as being either Sunni or Shia or Christian, although these individuals almost never openly identify themselves as such. What's that? You hear something? You want to go check it out? Whereas this same journalism refutes understandably to begin every description of Barack Obama as the black Obama or of Hillary Clinton as the white Clinton. Of course, people understand themselves to be a lot more nuanced than they do other people. Yeah. I do not, of course, deny the salience of the sectarian affiliations in the Middle East. But far too often, it seems to me, we allow the word Sunni or Shia to take the place of coherent, historically grounded argument, as if being Sunni or Shia is self-evident, and as if it precludes other forms of identification, and as if it was a singular identity. The reality is that, like the words fanaticism or barbarism or terrorism, analytically speaking, there is no such thing as a transhistorical sectarianism. There are instead specific and admittedly sometimes horrifying sectarian episodes that come about for a number of interrelated ideological, political, economic, and cultural reasons. I do not, in other words, see sectarianism as a stable, obvious, ever-present, singular social reality that floats above history. For this reason, I do not see my task in this brief essay to try and explain each and every sectarian event, for there is no such thing as an endlessly repeating story of sectarianism. Rather, my main point is to begin to think about how and why the idea of sectarianism and the sectarian has come to haunt the modern imaginary of the Arab world in much the same way the idea of racism has haunted the modern imaginary of the USA. Excuse me. This is not because sectarianism itself is age-old or free-floating. I've already indicated that, analytically speaking, there's no such thing. But that, much like racism in the contemporary USA, sectarianism is a diagnosis that makes the most sense when thought about in relation to its ideological antithesis. To identify and condemn racism in America, in other words, one presumably must uphold an idea of equality and emancipation. To identify and condemn sectarianism in the Arab world, one presumably has to uphold an idea of unity and equality between and among Muslims and non-Muslims. Where then to begin the story of modern sectarianism in the Middle East? As I've been grappling with what I see as the pervasive medievalization of the Middle East, in both America and the Arab world, think about how the otherwise radically different Bernard Lewis and the Syrian poet Adinus both just juxtapose an allegedly medieval Arab world with an allegedly normative modern secular West. There's things I'm thinking that I'm not saying. I am returned once again to the importance of the 19th century as a point of departure from any meaningful discussion of contemporary sectarian problems in the region. I say this for at least two reasons. First, because the breakdown in the 19th century of a long-standing Ottoman imperial system that has ruled for centuries over a vast, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multi-linguistic landscape opened the ideological and political space for new political imaginaries, horizons, and vocabularies, some of which were more inclusive and far less so. The Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453. They also conquered Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Cairo in 1516 and 1517, and ruled these areas under the fall of the empire as a result of World War I. And yet, intercommunal violence between Muslims and Christian Ottomans occurred primarily in the 19th century. That between Arabs and Jews occurred mainly in the 20th century, and between Sunni and Shia is unfolding before our eyes in the 21st century. The second and frankly more important reason why I begin in the 19th century is that I think the advent of the problem of sectarianism should be thought of as an expression of a global 19th century that introduced notions such as nationalism and citizenship and political equality, irrespective of religious affiliation to many parts of the world. My point is that many states struggled in the 19th century with new ideas of secular citizenship and equality, and struggled to reconcile these new notions of equality with long-standing convictions about religious and or racial difference. Yeah, not everybody's interested in that. Like, not everybody's interested in that. Just because these ideas exist doesn't mean that everybody wants to implement them. It is what it is. Different strokes for different folks, right? To put this point in simple, even crude terms, at the same time as the USA struggled with slavery and black emancipation, and Europe with the emancipation of Jews, and the Ottoman Empire was confronted with the question of the place of non-Muslims in what had long been a Muslim empire. To the extent we could speak about the DNA of modern oh my god. Gotta get used to that word. To the extent we could speak about the DNA of modern sectarianism, it surely lies in the fact that the Ottoman Empire had for centuries existed as what sociologist Karen Barkley describes as an empire of difference. That is to say, the precept of the House of Osman was to encourage, regulate, and maintain a dizzying patchwork of highly different and highly differentiated ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities that coexisted and conflicted across the empire. The so-called millet system reinforced the emphasis on religion in a profoundly unequal political and social order. At the top of this empire of difference sat the shadow of God on earth, the Sultan, whose rule was legitimized by his supposed upholding of Islam, his defense of the realm against the infidels, and his stamping out of heresy within it. What mattered for our story is that Ottoman Muslim supremacy was deeply imbued within the ideological, political, and legal terrain of the empire. The Sultan was also theoretically committed to maintaining order among and tranquility of all his disempowered and disenfranchised imperial subjects, including Christian and Jewish dhimmis. The point that needs to be made about this Ottoman system is not that it was tolerant or intolerant. Toleration in this empire, as in all empires, was but one of several imperial strategies that included coercion. Rather, the point that needs to be made is that the empire witnessed centuries of coexistence in which different Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities and the ecclesiastical leaderships of different communities accept the fact that they were bound to live side by side, to literally coexist for the foreseeable future. The rise of a modern sectarian politic. What then is the difference between this? Oh, I have to sneeze. No. False alarm. I think it's because I was going to say something and I didn't. It's just, look, I've only been in the Middle East for 5 years. It's a very short period of time. But, like, the way this is being laid out so far is like, oh my God, this is such a big mystery, and how could we ever understand it? And from where I'm sitting, like, a lot of the conflicts, the present conflicts that I'm aware of, are not a giant mystery. They're not really. I mean, I can't say I understand everything because I don't. I haven't. I'm not interested in everything, so I don't talk to everyone. I'm not interested in Iraq. I don't talk about, but I have basic gist of what's going on here in Israel, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iran, and like it makes sense why what's happening is happening. I might not like all the reasons, but it's not a giant mystery to me. Anyway, and the fact that some of them are being solved and some of them are not being solved is also not a mystery. That's like human behavior. Um, like just because something is not being solved doesn't mean it's not solvable. It just means people can't agree to solve it. Doesn't mean it's not solvable. What was I? Yeah, not everybody wants to see eye to eye. It's definitely, yeah, okay. Blah, blah, blah. What then is the difference between the pre-19th century form of the Ottoman rule and what I would describe as the 19th century politics of modern sectarianism? I I will say there's probably a bunch of stuff he's going to talk in this book that I don't know about, which is why it's going to be useful to me. Like I'm sure he'll fill in a lot of the gaps. Three overlapping interconnected factors. Okay, he's talking about what the difference between the 19th century Ottoman rule and 20th and 19th century modern politics. The first is the rise of ethno-religious nationalism, particularly in the Balkans, that fundamentally challenged Ottoman Muslim supremacy militarily, geographically, politically, and ideologically. The second factor, the second related factor, is the rise of sustained Western imperialism, imperial rivalries, and so-called imperial humanitarianism, which in turn precipitated a third factor, in Ottoman reformation that changed the logic and definition of empire. For being an empire of difference, the Ottoman state sought to become paradoxically an empire of citizens. The implications of this attempted transformation were enormous. For the first time in the history of any Muslim state, in 1839, the Ottomans implicitly accepted a revolutionary political equality of Muslim and non-Muslim subjects. That's interesting. They declared this equality more explicitly in 1856, and finally announced it constitutionally in 1876. The jizya, or poll tax on non-Muslims, was abolished in 1855. The concept of secular Ottoman citizenship was introduced in 1869, and the Ottoman purpose in this massive ideological and legal reordering of the empire, or Tanzimat, was clear. It was to stave off further European intervention and consolidate imperial power. Oh, that's very interesting. That feels like it sort of mirrors. I wonder if that's what's happening in Syria today. Well, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. Um, like how much of how the new Syrian state is shaping up to be, how much of that is in response to Western. We'll see. Okay. But within the empire, this sudden emphasis on non-discrimination as opposed to discrimination was predictably controversial. Excuse me. In several quarters, the formal emancipation of non-Muslims was met with unease and dismay, in some instances with sectarian violence against Christians. In Aleppo in 1850, an anti-conscription protest degenerated into a massacre of Christians in the city. Several churches were burned and hundreds of Christian homes were ransacked. So this is 1850. And then in Damascus, a decade later, in July 1860, a mob turned on the Christians of the city. The unprecedented massacres of Christians in Aleppo and Damascus coincided with a civil war in the neighboring Mount Lebanon between Maronite Christians and Druze, a war that also ended in 1860 in utter defeat and massacre of Maronite Christians in several towns. So the response, interesting. So the Ottoman Empire declared equality between all of its constituents, whether they were Muslim or not. And in response, there was a bunch of Christian massacres. You had Aleppo, you had Damascus, and then you had the Maronite Christians, the war between Maronite Christians and Druze in Lebanon. So, interesting. Not everybody was happy with that, apparently. The layers of sectarianism. Just like today, the Western press at the time insisted that this civilized world was witnessing, the quote, civilized world, was witnessing a spectacle of age-old Muslim Oriental fanaticism and sectarianism in the ostensibly uncivilized parts of the world, but descriptions of inherent fanaticism hardly explains why Damascus was the scene of a massacre in 1860, as opposed to, say, 1800 or 1900. The sectarian episodes of Aleppo and Damascus involved Muslims and Christians. In parentheses, it says obviously. But they were not about Islam and Christianity as such. They had nothing to do with the origins of Islam or with the Quran, just as today's sectarian battles have almost nothing to do with the original Shia Sunni schism. Instead, these events pointed to a very specific 19th century moment that witnessed three things happen simultaneously. The first was the sudden top-down disestablishment of a system of symbolic and legal Muslim supremacy without any cultural preparation on the part of Ottoman Muslims, elites whose empires were under enormous European military, political, and economic pressure. The second was the reality of Western imperialism. Western imperialism. I'm like a little tired of really long words. That claimed to protect. The second was the reality of Western imperialism that claimed to protect Christians in the Orient, who were themselves increasingly associated with Europe. And the third was the agency of the local Christians and Muslims who adopted a more stringent perspective on their newfound rights in a rapidly changing imperial landscape. That some Muslim inhabitants in cities such as Damascus felt as if they, as Muslims, were entitled to a privileged relationship to the state, which had long justified itself as a Muslim state, is not at all surprising. This dismay at reform is by no means a particular, quote, Muslim problem with equality or modernity. Consider how, in a far more structurally oppressive context, many white Americans fought bitterly against civil rights for African Americans. Equality, in other words, is not simply a virtue or a right, it is often felt to be an acute and painful concession. This feeling of resentment was compounded, of course, by the rise of Western imperialism in the Ottoman Empire. So it became impossible to separate the emancipation of Christians from Western imperialism. Interesting. The more that is interesting. Huh. Because in the Middle East, those two shouldn't necessarily be connected. But it seems like it has become to a degree. The more the Ottomans tried to secularize, the more the European powers, Britain and France, and Russia primarily, intervened as Christian powers with a duty to protect what they saw as the oppressed Christians of the empire. Okay. New section. It's titled Sectarian Institutions and the Question of Sovereignty. Oh, I forgot to put in honey. The thing is, like with this book, like every other word has like 20 syllables, which is fine, but it sort of like feels a little bit tongue twistery, and also it's using all the same words over and over again. I get it, it's for a reason, but it's a lot. Okay, let's see if that's good. Much better. What time is it? 9:15. Okay. Sectarian institutions and the question of sovereignty. Okay, there's like about 12, 13 more pages to this chapter, so I'm gonna finish the chapter and then take a break for today. These European interventions made it clear that as far as civilized Europe was concerned, the reformation of the Ottoman Empire had to be based on at least 2 points. The first was that there had to be a sectarian political framework to resolve what was taken to be endemic sectarian hatreds. And the second was that Muslim rule had to be disestablished for a modern regime of toleration to be established in the East. In other words, European powers refused to believe that a secular Ottomanism was a viable project in the sense that a secular Americanism or a secular Englishness or secular Frenchness was. They believed that any reformed Ottoman Empire needed constant European supervision. The British consul in Erzurum in Anatolia in 1856, James Brandt, admitted frankly that a reformed Turkey had to be maintained as an independent country because of the balance of power within Europe. He noted as well that her positive independence will have been placed in abeyance until she has learned to administer her own government on an enlightened and equitable system. Oh, it's just so silly. Nobody ever learns. Oh, people learn. But we also make a lot of the same mistakes over before we do. The upshot was that following the massacres of 1860, The Ottomans and European powers hammered out a series of political compromises that institutionalized sectarian political structures across the empire as a sign of Ottoman commitment to non-discrimination. Sectarian quota systems were thus put in place in Mount Lebanon and suggested for Bosnia and Crete. Such sectarian forms of political representation were manifestly not democratic. The inhabitants of Mount Lebanon, for example, were never consulted in the creation of the sectarian system put in place after 1861. They also entrenched and reified the communal and naturalized the idea that sectarian representation was the only viable key to resolving the problem of religious pluralism. Yet I think it is crucially important to understand these sectarian arrangements as political arrangements that maintained religious diversity in the context of a severely compromised Ottoman sovereignty. Recall the alternatives at the time. Either the discriminatory imperial state or the exclusionary Christian ethno-nationalisms that came to the fore in the 19th century Balkans. Ethno-religious nationalism indicated a fundamentally different form of modern political order than that suggested by the sectarian arrangements, one that was far more homogeneous, but also far more exclusionary. The point is that sectarian experiments were stopgap measures that failed to resolve the far greater problem of the spread of European Balkan nationalism and European imperialism, which increasingly stripped the empire of ever more territory, resources, and population. In regions such as Greece, the political imagination of the new Greek nation explicitly excluded Muslims. That's interesting. I didn't know that. This was also the case in Serbia, Crete, and Bulgaria between 1876 and 1913. Great numbers of Muslims were forced out of Europe and Caucasus in the 1860s and 1870s. The Treaty of Berlin of July 1878 stripped away 4.5 million, mostly Christian subjects from the empire, which also ceded 8% of its most fertile territory. This is soon followed by the British occupation of Egypt in 1882, the Italian invasion of Libya in 1911, and finally the cataclysmic Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. These assaults rendered the notion of a viable multi-religious citizenship obsolete in the eyes of the Ottoman Turkish rulers. The Muslims shared a total population that went from 60% before 1878 to 74% by 1907. That's a 14% rise in about, 88, 98, like 30 years, 29 years. In the aftermath of these catastrophic wars, Ottoman Turkish leaders became increasingly determined to create a modern and militarized nation state that they presumed would be essentially Muslim in order to be viable. It should come at no surprise that it was this era that witnessed the emergence of the Armenian question that led eventually to a genocide. As the Ottoman state lost more and more territory in the Balkans, it was determined to rid itself of what is now considered an untrustworthy Christian minority in Anatolia that had become a proxy for its Russian enemy, and thus had no place in what it saw as necessarily overwhelmingly Muslim Turkish state. An empire of multi-religious subjects, as well as on its way to becoming a state of its Muslim citizens. What? I didn't. As Ottoman state lost more and more territory in the Balkans, it was determined to rid itself of what it now considered an untrustworthy Christian minority in Anatolia, and had become a proxy for its Russian enemy, and thus had no place in what it saw as necessarily overwhelmingly Muslim Turkish state, an empire of multi-religious subjects, as well on its way to becoming a state of its Muslim citizens. Yeah, okay, so yeah, well, that's a shame. The how do you say this word? Ecumenical. Ecumenical? Ecumenical, representing a number of different Christian churches. Okay. Ecumenical Nada. Nada is an Arabic word, Nahda, in English, meaning the awakening, which is also referring to the Arab awakening or Arab Enlightenment, was a cultural movement that flourished in Arab-populated regions in the Ottoman Empire, notably in Egypt, Libya, Serbia, during the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century. The irony here is that the Arab Levant, the Mashriq, or the region that today encompasses, roughly speaking, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, the Palestinian territories, and depending on how broad we want to be, Egypt and Iraq, that had witnessed episodes of sectarian violence in the mid-century, were largely spared the tribulations of ethno-religious nationalism, border-making, nation-state formation, and ethnic cleansing in the final decades of the empire. There was, in other words, a great divergence in the late Ottoman Empire, a point that I think historians have simply not emphasized enough. The same late Ottoman state that directed genocidal violence towards the Armenians left Arab Christians, Muslims, and Jews to define new forms of coexistence on the basis of equality of male citizens. 15 to 20% of the total population of Greater Syria in 1914, i.e. total of 4.5 million, which was 10% in Egypt. There was no militant Arab nationalism to speak of, nor were there any major Arab Christian separatist movements. Western imperialism in the Levant was quite different from Russia and Austria-Hungary empire making in the Balkans. There was in the Levant, moreover, a common Arabic language. Many Arab Christians, such as the Butros al-Bastani, and as Lital Levy has noted, some Jews, such as Esther Moyle, played important roles in the so-called Nada, or Renaissance of Arabic thought, that blossomed in the second half of the 19th century. I do not mean to romanticize what I'm calling the ecumenical Nada, for there was also far less ecumenical strains of thought, and indeed some significant paradoxes, silences, and taboos, especially in the realm of gender and personal status laws, at the heart of this Nada discourse, which I explore elsewhere. Nevertheless, I don't think we have appreciated how quickly, in the decades after 1860, the equality of Muslims and non-Muslim male citizens in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt became relatively uncontroversial. The idea of outright secularism or the liberation of women were, in fact, far more controversial than political equality between male citizens in the empire, which is precisely why I emphasize here the idea of a self-consciously civilized modern ecumenical subjectivity that encompassed both Muslims and non-Muslims. This subjectivity allowed for different and, in several instances, ultimately incompatible understandings of the place of, quote, refined religions in the fostering of multi-religious, not anti-religious new multi-religious, not anti-religious public spheres. Okay. So rather than making a secular state, making room for multiple religions. That's interesting. I mean, that is a fundamentally different approach. Saying we're going to have a secular, focusing on secular and saying religions can be in it, or rather placing religion at the top but saying you can have multiple religions. It's a fundamentally different value system in terms of where you're placing secularism versus religiosity. Blah, blah, blah. The subjectivity, blah, 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 blah. Where was I? This subjectivity allowed for difference, and in several instances, ultimately incompatible understandings of the place of, quote, refined religion and the fostering of new multi-religious, not anti-religious public sphere. This sphere was legally predicated on the equality of all male subjects, irrespective of religious affiliation. This same subjectivity gave rise to modern abjurations of the religious. Abjuration means solemnly renounce. This same subjectivity gave rise to modern abjurations of, quote, religious fanaticism, and in the 20th century to the imagination of, quote, sectarianism as the antithesis of the rational modern way of life in the Arab world, and ultimately to nationalism and the idea of national unity. Perhaps equally important for us to consider this Nada, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, to be honest. Nada expression, this Nada expression of modern pluralism occurred at precisely the same time as the Anglo-Saxon US British Empire vehemently rejected the idea of racial equality. Indeed, at the same moment as the system of Jim Crow, racial segregation of separate but equal was being established in the US South. That's interesting. The colonial impact. The enormous and undeniable role of the Western powers, politically Great Britain and France, after World War II. Hang on a second. Just comfortable. No, I'm sorry, after World War I. Then, yeah, was the key to the creation of a fundamentally new sectarian terrain in the post-Ottoman Middle East. The problem is not simply that the British and the French created artificial states. All states are, after all, constructed, but the manner in which they coercively created these states along new and quite deliberately sectarian lines in the name of safeguarding religious freedom. France created a Maronite-dominated Great Liban. Are they trying to say Lebanon? It's Liban. I don't know. France created a Maronite-dominated Grand Liban that developed the region's most explicit yet ambivalent sectarian form of governance. France further partitioned Syria following the establishment of its mandate into Alawite, Druze, and Arab states based on religion and ethnicity. Thank you, French. I don't mean thank you. The French. Western imperialism was not monolithic, nor were its sectarian efforts monolithic, forming a single block. Yeah. Nor were its sectarian effects. The paradox of Western colonial rule was this: to construct an Ottoman whole into various sectarian parts at the same time as it tried to build up viable polities in a manner that safeguarded imperial hegemony. As much as Western imperialism invented the category of the so-called moderate Arab, it also gave these Arabs and many others besides an opportunity to share in the elaboration of colonial rule. The creation of the Hashemite Iraqi state is one example of this. Citing the case of newly established Shia courts in Lebanon during the French Mandate, Max Weiss has underscored the degree to which a local agency of Shia clerics and intellectuals during and after the Mandate was crucial to the new legal and political sectarianization of Shia identity that occurred in decades after World War I. Western colonial rule, nevertheless, also systematically fanned the fears and dependency of what were, for the first time, as Benjamin White had noted, described as, quote, minorities, Armenians in Syria and Assyrians in Iraq across the region. Hang on a second. Hang on. I have to go over that again. Western colonial rule, nonetheless, also systematically fanned the fears and dependency of what were, for the first time, as Benjamin had noted, described as, quote, minorities, Armenians in Syria and Assyrians in Iraq, across the region. At the same time, perversely, they created entirely new, quote, Islamic institutions to prove their, quote, respect for the region's Arab Muslim majority. The British in Palestine created the Supreme Muslim Council. The French elevated the Mufti of Beirut into representative of all Lebanon's Sunni Muslims. Both France and Britain further elaborated Ottoman-era sectarian personal status laws. Many Arab nationalist historians have insisted, with good reason, over decades that foreign intervention in the internal affairs of their nations has played a major role in the unfolding of events in the modern Middle East. Obviously. For example, the Egyptian Samir Murkuz, Murqus, has recently condemned what he insists is a cynical Western exploitation of Arab Christians to advance their imperialism in the region. His book was published with the endorsement of the Muslim Brotherhood, affiliated judge and intellectual Tariq Bishri. Scholars and political figures such as Murkuz and Bishri are right to point to European imperialism, beginning with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, continuing with the Anglo-French partition of the defeated Ottoman Empire in 1920, and culminating with Pax Americana in the current Middle East. This is a brute reality of Western involvement that simply cannot be denied, nor should it for a moment be obscured or obfuscated as secondary to self-inflicted wounds that allegedly really matter, as Fuad Ajami tendentiously put it. Tendentiously? Expressing or intending to promote a particular cause. See, yeah. But to reduce sectarianism to a question of colonial divide and rule is to ignore the powerful legacies of the 19th century that predated direct European colonial rule. This century bequeathed the colonial powers material, parentheses, not raw material, because the 19th century had already reworked those significantly, in parentheses, to exploit, reforms to discriminatory Ottoman imperial tradition as well as aggressive European imperialism provided Arabic-speaking subjects new opportunities and imposed new limitations on their ability to adapt, to reshape a late colonial age. Not surprisingly, one of the great counterpoints to a politically diffused ecumenical Arabic Nada that was flourishing under diminished Ottoman sovereignty was the advent of British-backed hold on, not surprisingly, one of the great counterpoints to a politically diffused ecumenical Arabic Nada that had flourished under a diminished Ottoman sovereignty was the advent of British-backed political Zionism in Palestine, which sought to transform the multi-religious land. Hi, Kitty. I see you. Multi-religious land of Palestine into exclusively Jewish state. The exclusive ethno-religious nationalism of Zionism germinated not in Ottoman soil, but in that of a highly radicalized Europe. It is surely significant, after all, that the terms Arab and Jew became antonyms in this period. Antonyms meaning words that are opposite of each other. It is significant that the first major intercommunal Arab-Jewish riots in Palestine occurred during the Mandate period. My point is that new Jewish and Arab questions were created in the Middle East where neither had previously existed. The Nakba of 1948, during which Palestinian Muslims and Christians left in mass, it says, were expelled in mass from their homes and lands, destroyed the Nada ethos in Palestine. The resulting Arab-Israeli conflict, moreover, severely compromised the Nada elsewhere by accelerating a xenophobic nationalism across the region and putting enormous strain and pressure on Jewish communities elsewhere, most notably, as Orit Bashkin has described in her most recent book, In Baghdad Itself. Yeah, I mean, the response to that basically... What are you doing, kitty? I mean, you had like, was it like 1 million Jewish people from across the Middle East were expelled from various Arab countries. Their land taken, their everything taken. So the eviction of hundreds of thousands Muslim and Christian Palestinian Arabs ironically sealed the fate of Jewish communities in the Arab world. The loss of multi-religious Palestine was a terrible blow that was compounded by the decline of Jewish life in the Arab world. The bifurcation, hi, hello, of the idea of being Arab and being Jewish still haunts the Arab world. You want to go up here? Yeah, and of course, I'm kidding. Say hello. All these occurrences, right? You have like the Nakba in here in Israel, and obviously the narratives are going to be different depending on who's telling it, whether they were left on their own volition, whether they were kicked out, and so on and so forth. But mainly, and then the response as well from Arab nations to kick out Jews from their lands who were not related to what was happening in Israel/Palestine at the time, just completely unrelated. But if it was in effect, then in some way it's not unrelated. Hi. You want to read too? Okay. What was my point here? Yeah, but yes, there was a really huge bifurcation at that point between the Arab and Jewish world. I suppose Christians as a result as well. Okay, the bifurcation of the idea of being Arab and being Jewish still haunts the Arab world. Yeah, and the other thing about the Jewish, the Jews being kicked out of Arab countries is that those Jews really identified with the Arab world. And so that loss of identity, they still carry that identity with them, but they've lost their place in those homelands. So they're sort of, yeah. there's definitely still a haunting there. There is no end to the story of the sectarianism in the modern Middle East, although I've tried to suggest here. What are you doing? Don't scratch that, kitty. Don't scratch. Thank you, not the couch. Go scratch something else. Good boy. Um, there's no end to the story of sectarianism in the blah 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 blah. Modern Middle East. I think I only have one page left, which is good because I'm getting tired. Though, as I tried to suggest here, there is a 19th century. No, kitty. Kitty, what are you doing? Kitty. Are you looking for. Oh, you're trying to eat the plant. Okay. As I've tried to suggest here, there was a 19th century. Okay, let's try this. Let's line this up. There's no end to the story of sectarianism. There's no quote end. It's in quotes. In the modern Middle East, although I've tried to suggest here, there was a 19th century beginning. The ascendancy of Zionism in Palestine was predicated on the defeat of secular Arabism, the historic defeats of 1948 and 1967, and the descent into authoritarian political culture in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the rise of oil-rich Saudi Arabia, and the extraordinary U.S. role in the region since the middle of the 20th century have radically and powerfully reshaped post-1948 modern Middle East. Yeah, I mean, a lot was just said in that one paragraph. What we need, and what I hope this chapter begins to chart, is a research agenda that can explore the dialectic between local histories of sectarian animosities, parentheses, in whatever part of the Middle East, and parentheses, and Western intervention. Dialectic between local histories of sectarian animosities and Western intervention. What we also need is more humility in our observations of the Middle East. The sectarian belongs not to the peculiar, but to the particular. It is not some medieval artifact, but a product of modern forces and circumstances and a history that after 1798 and 1821 or 1856, and certainly after 1920, can no longer be thought of as purely Middle Eastern or Arab or Islamic. Okay. All right, that's it for now.